The letter was the key. Not a key of steel or iron, but one of paper and ink, trembling in the hand of a doctor. It was April 19th, 2008, in the quiet Austrian town of Amstetten. A 19-year-old girl named Kirsten had been brought to the local hospital, unconscious and suffering from a mysterious, life-threatening illness. She had arrived in the arms of an old man, her grandfather, Josef Fritzl. He was frantic, but his story was riddled with holes. He claimed Kirsten had been left on their doorstep by her mother, his long-lost daughter Elizabeth. He even produced a letter, supposedly from Elizabeth, pleading for help. But the doctors were suspicious. Kirsten's teeth were in a state of decay they had never seen before. Her body showed signs of severe neglect, and her immune system was practically non-existent. Something was profoundly wrong. This wasn't just a sick girl. This was a medical enigma wrapped in a family tragedy. The hospital staff, sensing a darkness they couldn't yet name, made a decision that would crack the world open. They contacted the police and made a public appeal on television. Elizabeth Fritzl, wherever you are, your daughter Kirsten is dying. You must come forward. What no one in that hospital, no one in that town, no one in the world could possibly fathom was that Elizabeth heard their plea. She heard it not from a distant city where she had run off to join a cult, the story her father had meticulously crafted for 24 years, but from a small flickering television screen in a soundproofed dungeon buried deep beneath the very house from which the appeal was being discussed. She was just meters away. And the man who held her captive, the man who had stolen her life, her body, and her freedom, was the same man now playing the part of the distraught grandfather upstairs, her father, Josef Fritzl. The story of what happened in the cellar at 40 Strasse is not merely a story of captivity. It is a story about the complete and total fabrication of a universe. It demonstrates the terrifying power of a single malignant will to warp reality itself, and the unbelievable strength of the human spirit to endure within it. This is the story of a man who built a private kingdom of horror and the daughter who survived it. To understand the prison, you must first understand the architect. Josef Fritzl, born in 1935, was a man of precision, a man of control. To his neighbors in the placid town of Amstetten, he was unremarkable. A retired electrical engineer, a bit of a domineering patriarch perhaps, but a solid, ordinary citizen. He and his wife, Rosemarie, raised 7 children in their tidy home. They ran a small guest house. Life was structured, predictable, normal. But beneath this veneer of bourgeois respectability lay a foundation of cold, calculated cruelty. Fritzl's control over his family was absolute. He was a tyrant in his own home. His word was law, his anger a terrifying force. This need for domination had deep roots. He spoke later of a harsh upbringing, of a mother who didn't want him. He carried a darkness that he learned to mask with a plausible, even friendly exterior. Starting in 1978, 6 years before his daughter Elizabeth would vanish, this hidden darkness began to take physical form. Down in the cellar of his home, Josef Fritzl, the engineer, began a project. It was a slow, methodical process undertaken over years. He told Rosemarie he was building a workshop, a private space for his hobbies and plans. The noise, the endless bags of excavated earth, the tons of concrete and steel was all explained away with the casual authority she never dared to question. This was no workshop. It was a masterpiece of malevolent engineering. He dug deeper and wider, carving out a space from the earth beneath his own family. He poured reinforced concrete walls nearly a foot thick. He installed a series of steel doors, the final one weighing a half-ton, secured with electronic codes only he knew. To enter the final sanctum, one had to navigate a hidden passageway behind a shelf, pass through a total of 8 doors, each one a testament to his methodical paranoia. The final door, the one that sealed the prison from the world, was just 1 meter high and 60 centimeters wide. A tiny portal into hell. He soundproofed the walls with rubber linings and carpet, ensuring that no scream, no cry, no sound of life or suffering could ever travel the few meters up to the kitchen where his wife was cooking dinner or his children were doing their homework. He ran electrical wiring and ventilation, not out of compassion, but out of a perverse sense of ownership. These were his possessions, and they needed to be maintained. It was the work of a zookeeper, building a cage for an animal no one else would ever see. By 1984, the cage was complete. A warren of small, windowless rooms, damp and airless, totaling about 55 square meters. A cramped cooking area, a primitive toilet and shower, and sleeping spaces. This was the world he had built. All it needed was an inhabitant. His target was his own daughter, Elizabeth. She was 18 years old, a bright but timid girl on the cusp of adulthood. She had tried to escape her father's suffocating control once before, running away with a friend, but the police had found her and brought her home. Her brief taste of freedom only hardened her father's resolve. He saw her burgeoning independence not as a natural part of growing up, but as a rebellion against his authority, a threat to his absolute power. He decided to extinguish it completely. On August 28, 1984, he lured her into the cellar, asking her for help to carry a heavy object. As she stepped through the doorway, he pushed a cloth soaked in ether over her face. When she woke up, the half-ton door was sealed. The world she knew, the sun, the sky, the faces of her mother and siblings, was gone. Her life was over, and a new, monstrous one had just begun. Upstairs, the performance began. Josef reported Elizabeth missing. He told Rosemarie and the police a carefully constructed story. Elizabeth, he claimed, had run away to join a religious cult, something he knew she had shown a fleeting interest in. It was plausible, just plausible enough. Weeks later, he found a letter from her, a letter he had forced her to write in the cellar, postmarked from a town far away. It said she was tired of the family and warned them not to look for her. The police closed the case. Rosemarie cried. The family grieved. And Josef Fritzl, the concerned father, comforted them. All the while, his secret was breathing in the darkness beneath their feet. He had bifurcated his world. Upstairs, he was Josef Fritzl, husband, father, and citizen. Downstairs, he was a god in a concrete box, the sole arbiter of light, food, and life itself. The first years were a blur of terror and despair. Elizabeth, alone in the silent, artificial world, was subjected to her father's relentless sexual assaults. He was her jailer, her rapist, and her only human contact. He would visit several times a week, sometimes daily, bringing food and supplies. His arrivals were heralded by the distant rumble of the outer doors, a sound that became the terrifying rhythm of her existence. He was her sun and her moon, the source of everything and the source of all her pain. The core of Josef Fritzl's evil was not just the violence, but the psychological scaffolding he built around it. He convinced Elizabeth that the doors were electrified, that the ventilation would shut off if she tried to escape or make noise, that there were gas canisters that would flood the chambers if he didn't return. He was the master of his creation, and he made sure she knew that her survival depended entirely on her total, absolute obedience. Then the unthinkable happened. 2 years into her captivity, in 1988, Elizabeth gave birth. The child, a girl named Kirsten, was born on a dirty mattress in the cellar, with only her terrified young mother to help. Josef, ever the pragmatist, brought down scissors to cut the umbilical cord, along with parenting books and baby clothes. The birth of a child changed the dynamic in the dungeon. Elizabeth was no longer just a victim, she was a mother. She now had a reason to live that transcended her own survival. She had to protect this new life, to nurture it in a place utterly devoid of life. Over the next 14 years, she would give birth to 6 more children, all fathered by Josef. The cellar, designed for one prisoner, now had to accommodate a growing family. It was a grotesque parody of domesticity. Elizabeth became a teacher, a protector, a mother trying to create a semblance of normalcy in the most abnormal place on earth. She taught them to speak, to read, and to write using the few books and supplies her father provided. She established routines. They had meal times, playtimes, and bedtimes. She tried to describe the world outside, a world none of them had ever seen. How do you explain the sun to a child who has only ever known the hum of a fluorescent light? How do you describe wind or rain or the feeling of grass beneath your feet? She used the television her father provided, a small window into a universe they could see but never touch. For them, cars, trees, and other people were characters in a story, as fictional as any cartoon. 3 of the children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, remained in the cellar with Elizabeth their entire lives. They were her cellar children. Their world was a cramped 55 square meter space. They shared her mother's prison, their mother's protector, and their mother's tormentor. Josef was their grandfather, the man who brought them food and occasionally toys, but also the man whose footsteps overhead could signal a visit of unpredictable rage or violation. They were pale, with the sallow complexion of those who have never felt sunlight. Their immune systems were weak, and their social skills non-existent beyond their tiny family unit. But Josef Fritzl, the master manipulator, had another plan. 3 of the other children would become part of his upstairs family. In 1993, a baby girl, Lisa, appeared on the Fritzls' doorstep. Josef and Rosemarie found her, wrapped in a blanket with a note, supposedly from Elizabeth. The note begged her parents to care for the child, as she couldn't manage. Rosemarie, desperate for any connection to her lost daughter, accepted the story without question. How could she not? The alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. This macabre theater was repeated twice more. In 1994, Monica was left in the pram at the front of the house. In 1997, it was a boy, Alexander. Each time Fritzl orchestrated the discovery, he would force Elizabeth to write the pleading letters. He would even make fake phone calls, playing a recording of Elizabeth's voice, claiming she had dropped off another child. The social services were called, but Fritzl, the concerned grandfather stepping in to care for his abandoned grandchildren, played his part to perfection. He and Rosemarie were granted custody. And so the 2 families lived, separated by a few feet of concrete and a universe of lies. Upstairs, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander went to school.
They had friends. They went on holiday with their quote-unquote grandparents. They felt the sun on their faces. They lived in the real world, believing their mother was a tragic, absent figure who had abandoned them. Downstairs, their siblings, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, lived in perpetual twilight, their existence a secret known only to two people, their mother and their grandfather. This duality is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Fritzl's crime. He wasn't a recluse hiding in a shack. He was an active member of his community. He took his upstairs grandchildren on vacation to a lakeside resort he owned, leaving his other family locked in the cellar, sometimes for weeks, with just enough food and water to survive. He would sit by the lake with Rosemary, a doting grandfather, while just a few hours away, his other children and their mother languished in the dark, counting the minutes until the sound of the locks announced his return. The sheer psychological audacity is breathtaking. He managed not one, but two families, two realities, switching between the roles of loving grandfather and monstrous captor as easily as flicking a light switch. For 24 years, he held the walls of this fabricated reality in place through sheer, unadulterated force of will. For 8,642 days, the secret held. But no structure, no matter how reinforced, can stand forever. In the cellar, life was becoming untenable. The children were growing up. The space, already claustrophobic, felt smaller every day. The dampness and lack of fresh air were taking a toll on their health. It was a pressure cooker, and the valve was beginning to fail. The catalyst was Kirsten. By 2008, the eldest cellar child was 19. She was chronically ill, her body weakened by years of confinement. She began having debilitating seizures, lapsing in and out of consciousness. Elizabeth, watching her firstborn child fading before her eyes, was frantic. She begged and pleaded with her father. For years, her own suffering hadn't been enough to move him. But the imminent death of one of his cellar children, a complication he couldn't control, finally forced his hand. This presented Fritzl with an unsolvable logistical problem. How could he get medical help for a girl who, according to the official story of his life, did not exist? He couldn't just carry an unregistered, pale gray young 19-year-old into a hospital. His carefully constructed world was threatening to collide with the real one. For days, he hesitated. He tried to treat Kirsten himself, bringing down medication, but her condition worsened catastrophically. She was dying. Elizabeth's pleas became demands. This was her child. He had to do something. The force of her maternal desperation, a power he had suppressed for over 2 decades, was now something he could not ignore. Finally cornered and out of options, Fritzl relented. His meticulous control was slipping. He concocted one last, desperate story. He would take Kirsten and claim, as he had with the others, that Elizabeth had left her on the doorstep, this time with a note explaining her severe illness. On April 19, 2008, Josef and Elizabeth carried the unconscious Kirsten up the stairs from the cellar. For Elizabeth, it was the first time she had seen the upstairs of her own home in 24 years. It must have felt like a dream. The familiar rooms of her childhood, now aged and changed. They carried Kirsten out into the night. It was the first time Kirsten had ever been outside. The first time she had ever felt night air on her skin. Fritzl drove her to the hospital. He left her there, playing the part of the shocked grandfather who had just discovered his sick granddaughter. He produced the letter that he had forced Elizabeth to write. But this time, the story was too thin. A 19-year-old girl with no medical records, no history, suffering from organ failure? The doctor's suspicions were a spark, and the media appeal they launched was the oxygen that would turn it into an inferno. Back in the cellar, Fritzl showed Elizabeth the news report on the small TV. The police were looking for her. The world was calling her name. For Fritzl, it was a threat. He warned her that if she ever came out, if she ever told anyone, terrible things would happen.
He reinforced his threats about the gas and the electrified doors, but something had shifted. For 24 years, Elizabeth had been completely isolated. Now she knew the outside world was looking for her. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She had a name, and people were saying it. The hope that she had buried alive for 2 decades began to stir. The pressure on Fritzl was immense. The police were investigating. They were re-examining the old missing person file. They were talking to him, questioning him. His story about the cult was being scrutinized with fresh eyes. For a man whose entire existence was predicated on absolute control, the feeling of being watched, of being questioned, was intolerable. The tipping point came a week later, on April 26th. Fritzl, buckling under the police inquiry and the weight of his own lies, made a final, fateful decision. He told Elizabeth he was taking her and the other 2 cellar children, Stefan, 18, and Felix, 5, out of the dungeon for good. He was going to claim that Elizabeth had finally decided to come home from the cult, bringing her other 2 children with her. It was a ludicrously improbable story, his last gamble to try and contain the catastrophe. He led them out, up the stairs, into the house, and into the world. For Stefan and Felix, it was the first time they had ever seen sunlight. 5-year-old Felix looked up at the sky and saw the moon. He pointed, his eyes wide with a wonder we can barely comprehend. "Is that the god?" he asked. When Elizabeth Fritzl walked out of the house at 40 Ibstrasse, she was 42 years old, but she looked like a ghost. Her hair was white, her skin a pallid gray. She walked with a stoop, her eyes blinking against a sun she hadn't felt on her face since she was a teenager. The 2 boys with her were equally spectral, terrified and overwhelmed by the sheer sensory overload of the world. Fritzl's plan to integrate them into a new lie fell apart almost instantly. At the hospital, where they had gone to see Kirsten, the police were waiting. They wanted to speak to Elizabeth, alone. Josef tried to stay with her, to control the narrative one last time, but the police insisted. For the first time in 24 years, Elizabeth was in a room with other people and her father was not there. At first, she was silent, reciting the story her father had drilled into her, the cult, the return, the other children. But the lead investigator, a man named Leopold Etz, sensed the terror behind her vacant eyes. He made her a promise. He guaranteed her that she would never have to see her father again. He promised her that her children would be cared for. He promised her safety. It was that promise that finally broke the dam. For 2 hours, the story poured out of her, a torrent of pain and horror that had been suppressed for nearly a quarter of a century. She told them everything: the cellar, the rapes,
the births, the children who lived above and the children who lived below. She spoke of the darkness, the fear, the endless days, and the 8,642 nights. The police officers listening to her testimony were in a state of shock. The story was so monstrous, so beyond the pale of human experience, it seemed impossible. But it was delivered with a detail and a consistency that was irrefutable. They went back to the house. Fritzl, still believing he was in control, denied everything. He was the victim here, the grandfather who had been taken advantage of. He showed them the cellar, his workshop. He pointed to the shelves, the tools. See, nothing. But Elizabeth had told them where to look. She had drawn them a map. Behind one of the shelves, they found it, a hidden door reinforced with steel. They couldn't open it. They brought Fritzl back and demanded the code. He refused. Finally, with Elizabeth's confirmation relayed to them by phone, they told him they were going to bring in an engineering crew to smash through the concrete. His creation, his fortress, was about to be breached. His control was gone. Defeated, Josef Fritzl whispered the code. The heavy steel door swung open, revealing the narrow passage beyond. As the police navigated the series of locked doors, a wave of cold, stale air washed over them. It was the smell of a tomb, of unventilated human existence. When they finally entered the living space, the reality of Elizabeth's story hit them with the force of a physical blow. The cramped, windowless rooms, the primitive kitchen, the children's drawings taped to the damp concrete walls, pathetic splashes of color in a monochrome world. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was another planet. Josef Fritzl was arrested. The world he had built was shattered, its contents spilling out into the blinding light of day. The news exploded across the globe. Amstetten, the quiet Austrian town, became the epicenter of a story of almost mythical horror. The House of Horrors at 40 Ibstrasse became a global landmark of evil. The two families, the upstairs and the downstairs, collided. Rosemarie Fritzl's world disintegrated. The husband she had lived with for over 50 years was a monster. The daughter she had mourned was alive and had been living beneath her feet. The grandchildren she had raised were the products of incestuous rape. The sheer psychological devastation is impossible to articulate. All of Elizabeth's children were brought to a special clinic, shielded from the ravenous media. For the first time, the two sets of siblings met. The upstairs children, who knew about school and friends and sunshine, met their pale, terrified siblings from the cellar, who were frightened by the flushing of a toilet and the automatic sliding of a door. Under the care of a team of doctors and psychologists, they began the slow, painful process of becoming one family. Elizabeth, freed from her prison, now faced a new challenge, being a mother to all of her children in a world she barely recognized herself. The trial of Josef Fritzl began in March 2009. He was charged with murder for the death of an infant son, a twin who died shortly after birth in the cellar, rape, incest, enslavement, coercion, and false imprisonment. The key evidence was the testimony of Elizabeth. To spare her the trauma of facing him in court, her testimony, over 11 hours long, was videotaped and played for the judges. For most of the trial, Fritzl was defiant, hiding his face behind a blue binder. He admitted to the imprisonment and the incest, but he framed it in his own warped logic. He wasn't a monster. He claimed he was just trying to create a safe place for his daughter, to protect her from the outside world. He denied the slavery and murder charges. The turning point came when Elizabeth, in an act of unimaginable courage, decided to appear in court. She walked into the courtroom and sat in the gallery, looking directly at her father. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him. For the first time, she was not the victim in the cellar. She was free. She was in the light, and he was in the cage. Seeing her there, seeing the daughter he had broken now whole and staring him down, something in Josef Fritzl finally snapped. The next day, he changed his plea. He stood up and confessed to all charges. He said, "I plead guilty," his voice barely a whisper. He was sentenced to life in a secure psychiatric institution. His kingdom was gone, his reality shattered, and he was left with nothing but the echo of his own evil. In the years that followed, the family began the long, quiet work of healing. Elizabeth and all 6 of her children were given a new identity and moved to a secret location in the Austrian countryside. For the first time, they were a complete family, living together under one roof with doors that opened and windows that let in the sun. The cellar at 40 Ibstrasse was filled with concrete in 2013. The authorities wanted to ensure it could never again become a place of morbid pilgrimage, to seal the physical memory of the horror forever. The house itself was eventually sold and renovated, its dark history erased by new walls and new life. The story of Elizabeth Fritzl is ultimately one of survival against impossible odds. It is a testament to a mother's love forged in the deepest darkness. She not only survived her own personal hell, but she successfully raised 3 children within it, nurturing them and teaching them and keeping them alive until the day the world finally found them. Their recovery is a quiet victory, happening far from the eyes of the world that was so captivated by their horror. They learned to live with the sun, to navigate a world of choices and freedom that was entirely alien to them. Felix, the little boy who thought the moon was God, learned to ride a bike. The others went to school, made friends, and slowly, painstakingly built new lives. The case remains a stark warning. It shows us the terrifying darkness that can hide behind a mundane suburban facade. It reminds us that evil is not always a distant, shadowy force, but can be the man next door, the unassuming father, the meticulous engineer. But more than that, the story of Elizabeth Fritzl and her children is a profound and powerful echo of the human spirit's refusal to be extinguished. Even after 8,642 days in the dark, the will to live, to love, and to reach for the light can, in the end, be unbreakable.